This time I'm going to talk in nuts and bolts about a particular mechanic that's very popular in tabletop games, the worker placement mechanic. It's a way to allocate a player's efforts. It's not so different in some ways from action points. But worker placement can involve interfering with what others are trying to do, which is not usual with action points, and it's usually done incrementally rather than one player takes his turn and does whatever he does, and then the next player takes his turn and does whatever he does, which tends to be the case with action points. So you allocate a worker, which is usually just a pawn of some kind or a meeple, to a particular task, and then what happens? In exclusive worker placement, no one else can allocate a worker to that task. In priority worker placement, others can allocate a worker to that task, but it costs them more because they got there later, or it lets them do less because they got there later. In shared worker placement, anyone who allocates there has the same opportunities and abilities, which is much like action points. So this becomes merely a way to allocate your resources or actions. And there are, of course, more variations. You can have one worker or you can have several. You can acquire more workers so that you have more than someone else, or you have less than someone else. Some workers can be better than others at what they're doing, and so on. There's a lot of room to do various things. There's a tendency to broadly apply this term to games that I don't think of as worker placement games. For example, Glenn Drover's Empire's Galactic Rebellion. That game is about what you do with your resources. It even has non-Euro elements such as the Galactic War at the end. To me, it makes little sense to call it a worker placement game, but people seem to like to refer to games as worker placement games. I personally don't care for worker placement, especially the exclusive worker placement. I want games to be a greater or lesser extent a model of some real situation, even if that's a fictional situation, a quote-unquote real world. If I'm doing things in the game that I cannot associate with doing something in the real world, then the game had better be purely abstract. Now that's my personal preference. Not everybody thinks that way. To me, purely abstract games are games with one or a few simple mechanics that present interesting problems. Also, I'm educated as an historian, and I've heard all kinds of bullpucky explanations for why something or other corresponds to the real world that are nonsense. I have a much higher standard, I guess you would say, because I understand how history works, how the real world works. At the other end of the spectrum, where worker placement is a form of tracking action points, that's fine. It's just a somewhat different way of doing it. And that can directly relate to the real world. I just like to find a different way to express it. Action points, to me, is a fine way to put the player on the horns of a dilemma, which is the original reason for games. A fine way to make people make choices when they want to do more than they can do. Worker placement tends to be incremental, where using action points tends to be one player at a time, but neither is necessarily so. Now the other thing here, and what really disturbs me, is that worker placement is used more or less as an end in itself rather than as a means. In other words, worker placement seems to dominate the game, to be the game. It's a worker placement game. And that's not what mechanics are for. What really matters in a game is the impression the game makes on the players through the interaction of the mechanics and the players. What mechanics you use are not particularly important compared to this impression the game makes on the players. I like games to have a context. Saying it's a worker placement game is not much of a context, and it's not what you should talk about first when you're describing the context. You should talk about what the game is about, which is what it models. Or if it doesn't model something, you should talk about it, how it's a simple abstract game, or that it's a puzzle game, which is what most of the worker placement games really are, with some atmosphere or decoration theme attached. Theme, quote unquote. If I were a publisher and a designer started his pitch by saying his or her game is a worker placement game, first I'd say to myself, oh my God, another amongst hundreds of anonymous worker placement games. Why should I care? And second, I'd think the designer didn't know what he was doing or she was doing because they talk about mechanics first instead of the context of the game and how to win as well. Those come before mechanics. It's a popular mechanic for sure, and I see lots of games called worker placement that don't look like that to me. Your mileage may vary. Thanks for listening.